Yeah, and then we can go straight in. Actually, I'll have the wireless one ready for him. That's better for him. There are good seats here. How are you? Thanks for being here. It's very nice to welcome you. George.
Hey, George.
Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, rooms to see you. So we're just standing here. Is that okay with you? Actually, we found you were here. Actually, here. Because I need to see if this is okay. And I can see here. Yeah, I leave it here. You know what? How are you? You too. Down there, so you know what I mean?
This is on.
It's on.
Okay, good evening, everyone. You can hear me at the back? Good. Good evening. Welcome to Glucksman Ireland House. I'm Kevin Kenny, the director. It's our great pleasure this evening to welcome Ambassador Geraldine Byrne Nason, Ireland's permanent representative to the UN, in conversation with our own Ted Smyth. And I'll say a few words of introduction in just a moment. Also delighted to acknowledge that Loretta Brennan Glucksman is here with us this evening, and members of our board, friends and members of the House. So very, very special evening for us. During her career, Ambassador Byrne Nason has served in Brussels, Paris, Vienna and Helsinki, as well as New York City, including a term as Ambassador and Ireland's Deputy Permanent Representative to the EU and Director of the National Forum on Europe. As Second Secretary in the Department of the Taoiseach from 2011 to 2014, she was the highest ranking female public servant in Ireland, and I know and will hear more this evening about gender and women's equality as a theme in the Ambassador's work. Ambassador Byrne Nason took up her current position at the UN in August 2017 on completion of her term as the Irish Ambassador to France. And since her arrival in New York, she has served as chair of the UN Commission on the Status of Women, the principal global intergovernmental body exclusively dedicated to the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women. She also co-chaired high-level political negotiations on the 100th anniversary of the birth of Nelson Mandela, and she works on the Small Island Developing States initiative. Ireland is a small island and in many ways developing state, but this is a category that covers island nations around the world that share similar economic, demographic and environmental challenges, and that work culminated most recently in the summit in September 2019. Ambassador Byrne Nason holds bachelor's and master's degrees in literature from St. Patrick's College, National University of Ireland, Maynooth, as well as an honorary doctorate in law from Maynooth. In 2014, she was elected a member of the Royal Irish Academy, Ireland's highest academic honour. So welcome to NYU and to Glucksman Ireland. Secondly, I want to introduce Ted Smyth, although he is a friend to many of you and to us in Ireland House and to me. We met in court about a year and a half ago when I was kicking off this stage of my career. We've become very close confidants and collaborators here in Ireland House. Ted is the chair of our president.
It's a dirty word these days, but that's the word.
Yeah, worse than the chair, he is the president of our academic advisory board, and Ted and I work closely together. Ted is a native of County Meath, graduate in history, good choice, history and politics from Trinity College, Dublin. After which he became a diplomat in the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs, serving as a delegate to the East-West Conference on Security and Cooperation in Geneva, then in Lisbon during the Portuguese Revolution in 1975, subsequently as head of press and information in the United States for the Irish government, focusing on solutions to the Northern Ireland conflict and promoting Irish and Irish-American culture. Hosted Back to Ireland, Ted, a member of the Secretariat of the New Ireland Forum, which following a year of debates and negotiations published a report endorsed by all democratically elected nationalists that recognized for the first time the equal rights of nationalists and unions in Northern Ireland. Ted moved on from the diplomatic world, initially on the leave of absence to join Tony O'Reilly at Heinz, I believe.
Making ketchup. I made all the ketchup.
Making ketchup in Pittsburgh, and from there to McGraw Hill here in New York City. Since then, his finest accomplishment, he took an MA in Irish and Irish American Studies here in Glucksman. Ireland has our interdisciplinary program, and I don't hold mind spilling the confidential beans this evening by telling you that that thesis will be published very soon in a leading journal, the Journal for American Ethnic History, which is great for TED and great for our program. On that happy note, I'm going to turn it over to so Ted will lead a conversation with the ambassador, after which we will open up the usual conversation with the audience, and after that, of course, we will move downstairs for the reception. So thank you.
There will be alcohol consumed. Thank you, Kevin, for that very generous introduction. And good evening, all. Thank you for coming out on this soft Irish evening. And I'm delighted to see that the other board members are here, including George Doherty, Sean Kelly, Judith McGuire, maybe missing some others, and distinguished faculty. I had the pleasure of learning from them. Professor Mick Maloney, Professor Marion Casey, Miriam Nye, maybe some others here. Anyway, it was a fabulous, I'll give a little plug for a second. The MA is a fabulous thing to do.
Yes.
It's rejuvenating and it's inspiring. The teachers are tough and robust, and but you learn so much. So I'm very happy that I did that. So we have a great evening in store for you with the magnificent Ambassador Geraldine Byrne Nason. I'll start out by asking a few questions, but then I want you to have your questions ready so we can have a traditional, lively Irish evening. Now, as you heard from Kevin, the Ambassador has chalked up enough achievements for at least 5 people in her lifetime. And I won't recount those again, but Brett Bruin, in a recent description of an outstanding career US Foreign Service officer, could have been speaking of the Ambassador when he wrote, "She's your ideal example of a diplomat, cool under pressure, confident, super smart, and deeply committed to the mission." So that's our Ambassador. When I became an Irish diplomat in '72, there was still a marriage ban on married women staying on in the public service. In fact, sitting across from me in my first job was a distinguished civil servant called Tony Nolan. And she was in her 50s, but she hadn't married because she wanted to hold on to her job and her economic independence. That ban thankfully ended a year later, and we've made significant progress since then, as you can see from tonight, but still a way to go. So, my first question, Ambassador, is how did a young woman with a BA and an MA in literature reach the top of the Irish public service and become chair of the UN Global Commission on Women?
Starting with honours maths questions first. One important element of my biography, which you omitted to mention, I'm afraid, Kevin, is that I'm from Drogheda. That probably explains a lot. So I could leave it at that. For those of you who are not Irish natives, you won't know that the county I come from, County Louth, borders on the county Ted comes from, and there's a fair degree of competition between us. But that doesn't explain it all. Look, I have to admit at the top that this wasn't part of a grand design or a plan. Am I too close to the microphone for comfort? No, is that okay? As you said, I studied literature, so I didn't enter as a freshman knowing what I wanted to do in my career. I really saw myself staying in an academic zone. So it was a chance encounter that moved me to diplomacy. I won a scholarship and was told I couldn't have the money unless I signed up for some career advice, and I obviously duly did that. I have to say, when I joined, I joined the Foreign Service in 1978, and most women in the Foreign Service at that point were junior officers, so there were very few of us who had really scaled the heights. At that point there had only been, I think, one female ambassador in the system. So we were, all of us, really in many ways learning by doing. The Irish system still doesn't and didn't then have a formal training system. So we literally were on the job from day one, and I think that was a huge advantage, remained so for young Irish women in particular, that we weren't put into a competitive zone in an academic training session before we were let out. That we were, I think, allowed very quickly to use what I regard as very strong female skills, the soft power skills, the capacity to listen. I think being a female diplomat, frankly, on occasion is easier than being a male diplomat. I don't feel women are as driven to engage publicly and speak their minds straight away. So listening and learning was a huge part of our early training. And I, very early on, also took a sort of a liking for the multilateral diplomacy, what we call multilateral. So an opportunity to be trading your country's interests around a big table with a lot of other diplomats, which allows you to work on substance but also hones your skills culturally across a lot of countries. So I spent time initially here in New York, and then subsequently in disarmament, went on to work in Brussels. So that notion of being at a table with your peers, persuading in your country's interests, a skill, as I say, I think is a soft diplomatic skill. We weren't, as young diplomats, forced into what is now a more tough environment, I think, for young diplomats on the field, trying to promote trade policy, for example, or be involved in foreign direct investment discussions. So it was, I would regard, a fairly easy entry. And from my own point of view then, I guess I also did something that wasn't recommended. I still recommend it to young women diplomats, which is I took the risk of leaving the diplomatic service. You are a stellar example of someone who never had to come back. I took the risk of jumping ship.
Like you had.
No, but I took the risk of jumping ship. Having tasted that for 8 or 10 years, I felt that there was an opportunity outside the Foreign Service, so I jumped twice. So I jumped initially into the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, and there I wasn't hidebound by a hierarchy that was in place in Ireland in terms of seniority, and so I did well in the OECD for 10 years and came back into the system again, but then was plucked out then finally for my last exit by Taoiseach Enda Kenny and Taoiseach Gilmore when they brought me back from Brussels, essentially to head up the economic recovery. So I jumped in and out a bit, and I think for younger women it's really important. I would argue made my career, the idea that I was as good as my last job and that I could build in a modular way. So a soft diplomatic route, multilateralism, and building your career over time in a modular way.
Well, clearly you have extraordinary skills, and that's not something that's easily taught. Do you have any advice for, sometimes they say that people should have a rabbi early on, and if you can stick with that rabbi, it helps your career. Did you feel you had a rabbi or a number of rabbis?
A number, I didn't have a one single one that I could point to. I was lucky, I guess, to have a number. Some of them were political in the sense that I would, in the longer term, always have looked as a guiding light to Mary Robinson's career, and she certainly was an inspirational one. I worked very closely with some outstanding public servants one who comes to mind always when I say that is Maurice Hayes, who is known in this house. But I would say Maurice, who was the most senior public servant in Northern Ireland of Roman Catholic nationalist background at a very difficult time, came as a wonderful European to assist Ireland in time of need when we were having a sort of repeat offence and losing European referenda. And by chance I was asked would I sit with Maurice in the Forum on Europe, which you mentioned in the introduction, the chance of a lifetime. I spent, and it wasn't time again, it's this I would say almost unnatural learning environment that seems to suit me, in that it was in the back of a bus. Maurice didn't drive and I didn't have a car, so we had many bus trips in Ireland together. It was watching him sit patiently listening to several countries who were several political groups who were Eurosceptic in Ireland, allowing them to speak themselves out of their position, and explaining to me as I went what he was doing. You know, skills, as you said, that you know, you don't, they're not academic skills, they're not skills really that can be passed on. You observe them. So, I mean, they're two people I just pick out, comes out. I didn't have one.
Very good ones. In fact, Maurice won the Brain of Britain when he was young.
Did he?
Which was very distinctive. George Mitchell strikes me, Senator, as another person who had that capacity to listen. People used to go into him when he was envoy in Northern Ireland from different parties and complain to him for 6 hours about the other side, and he would just nod his head. And then when they'd come out of the room, they'd say, that George Mitchell is a genius. He understands everything.
Good accent.
And so there's a bit of that. So just to finish, there are a lot of young people here, and I'm really glad to see so many. When you're young, and maybe when you're female, but also when you're male, how do you deal with, particularly if you're female, with this sort of accidental or the put down in the old days, the misogynist who thinks you're there to make the tea? Is there a humorous way you can deal with it? And I won't actually touch too much on the Me Too movement, but you know, again, for young women, they have to navigate waters, and maybe the workplace is a better place these days, but these are issues.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I have to say I have been lucky in my own experience. I've had occasion to say to some other women, that actually never happened to me, but one of the reasons I think that I was lucky is that there is a sense of self that's important in these situations, and a sense that, you know, probably it would have been harder, you know, to try and tell me that I should make the tea, because I didn't come across quite as somebody who was amenable to that kind of a suggestion. You know, I'm not saying that people can't be, the strongest women can't be challenged in situations, but I think a quiet self-confidence is important, and I would honestly say that I acquired that from an extraordinary mother, Helen, who still is with me. She's somewhere on one of those chairs this evening. But from women educators, from nuns who educated me right throughout my career as a young student through to going to college, where I never for a moment had a sense that they weren't, you know, absolutely capable and in the right place, and powerful women in our society at shaping our young minds. It never struck me that we could be challenged in that. So, you know, I think that being surrounded by strong women, and I think Irish society is good at that. We have, I don't know if we would describe ourselves over time as matriarchal, but we have a deep respect for the feminine, and even if some of our institutions haven't expressed that, over time, I think that we have found our way constantly in the UN. These days, people remark to me how extraordinary, egalitarian, how progressive Irish society now looks. And you mentioned the marriage bar. You know, when I say in 1973 you had to resign, they find that rather extraordinary that we are suddenly where we are today. I think the fine, strong line of the feminine goes right through that. And I'm lucky to have absorbed some of that in my own education.
I saw some evidence of that in your splendid office overlooking the UN and the East River, where you have lots of photographs of yourself with the great and the good, the heads of state around the world. But the one that struck me was a black and white shot of suffragettes marching in Drogheda in 1916. And tell us what the significance of that photograph is for you.
I think you just slight difficulty saying Drogheda there, Ted, but it's okay, it's okay. Yeah, actually, I look at that, I look at that every single day. It was an extraordinary moment. I had a mayoral delegation. In my office, they joke, my husband says I'm from the Independent Republic of Drogheda, and my office always argue that I'm the ambassador of Drogheda first, I'm the ambassador of Ireland second. But a delegation came from Drogheda and they were carrying a lot of it, and I was actually in a busy day and I thought, oh my goodness, but you know, what's in the bag? And they took out a frame, and it was a frame, a black and white photograph of the main street in Drogheda with white dressed women marching, suffragettes in 1916. And they thought that it would mean something to me. And for me, the idea that deep spirit of female intention was alive on the streets that I grew up in as a child, which was a very small rural town where when you left, your parents put your name inside your coat going to Dublin in case you never came back. This was extraordinary that women in my town were on the barricades speaking for an independence for women that came 40 or 50 years later. And as you say, I'm very lucky to have a splendid office looking at the Parliament of Man, somewhere I never thought growing up in Drogheda I could even imagine being. But those women are there with me, and I think that's the nice thing.
So let's turn to the Parliament of Women and Men, the United Nations itself. Ireland's President Higgins recently said that the UN brings and can bring out what is best in us. And the question for you is the UN relevant to our lives today? Why do we hear, for instance, so little about the peacekeeping operations? We used to hear a lot about them when there was a conflict. And we've had conflicts in Syria and Africa, but we seem to hear less. What's going on?
I mean, President Higgins, I have to say, did us all proud this year. He, for the first time ever, the President delivered our national statement. It's normally done by a member of the government, and he spoke about the UN as a house of hope. And I have to say, of course, I want to believe that that's where it is, because that's what makes me get up and go out every day. I'd have to admit at the moment, it's a house of some disquiet, of an uneasiness. I would say uncertainty. The peacekeepers are there. There's 100,000 men and women wearing blue helmets right now, tonight, in the most dangerous parts of the world. 80 of them died this year. Every single day we hear of attacks. They're attacked. But why are we not hearing about them? I think there's a sense in the UN, and the UN is an institution. It doesn't exist without its member states. There's 193 member states there, but there is a sense that there's an unraveling of sorts underway, and it's not limited, I would have to say, to the top table. You know, the top table we think of at the UN as the Security Council, the 5 permanent members who are there, the victors of the Second World War, anachronistic as that may be, US, UK, Russia, China, France, and did I leave somebody else? That's 5. They're at loggerheads, and I mean that's now a term that people will recognise in that house of hope, that the 5 powers are at loggerheads in different regions, whether it's Syria or Yemen, and not always on the same issue. The Chinese and the Americans obviously not seeing eye to eye, the British not agreeing with the Russians on several issues. So they're at loggerheads, but it's a bigger fracturing. Some people talk in the UN about centre of gravity being lost, or a fault line. I think it's a genuine fracturing of an old order, and I don't, the institution is doing its best to keep a roof on the house, I would say, but if you look across the way in which the order is breaking up, I think the idea of multilateralism itself, the idea of doing business among several countries around a table with a common shared approach, is contested even now in the UN. I think there is a sort of a rampant unilateralism We know in our host country in the United States that's a popular policy for the current administration, but it's not limited. You know, there are many countries waiting in the wings. There are known unknowns. You look at the positioning of the United States as it withdraws, some would use the term retreat, at that top table and in the 193 country rooms, and you look at who occupies that space, and contrary to popular opinion, that actually isn't Russia, it's China is moving in there. So some would say we'll look at Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, and I disagree slightly with him on this, says the UN may be seeing now in-house a sort of a duopoly emerge, where you have the US and China at polar ends of two systems with their own economic models, with their own currencies, with their own artificial intelligence, with their own internet, with their own social systems, and that you will find at one end perhaps other countries who are cleaving to a Chinese model, and you have to watch what's happening in the Pacific and in Africa, where countries may feel more comfortable in surrendering certain rights, certain what we would regard as democratic fundamental rights, in exchange for a state-run economy that's producing jobs and lifting people out of poverty. You have to say the Chinese model has done something none of us have ever seen economically, and no one knows where it will end. That's one risk in the UN. I think myself, it's going to find itself more multipolar, and there's where our interest will definitely play. I think you're looking at a bigger horizon. The US and China certainly, the European Union, and India, question mark, I would probably say. But I'm not mentioning there, if you think about it, if you think of what the UN feels like, where's Japan? Where's the UK? Where's Russia? Where are the Australians, for example? They will have to make up their mind. There's a sort of an identity crisis issue for big countries like that, who looked like they were major shapers of a global agenda. So everyone is sort of watching everyone else. The net result in the UN is the peacekeepers are on the field. There's a huge amount of good work being done. Nobody talks about successful elections in the DRC or in Madagascar, countries that are not on an NPR every morning. People aren't recognizing that there is actually a dialogue going on in Afghanistan. Women aren't being included, another issue, but there's dialogue underway. The South Sudanese have a sort of a political process in place. Even in Syria, constitutional committee now looking. So there is progress. So I'm not saying that this is a dark house. The vulnerable, the marginalized, migration, climate change, we can talk about those. Those issues are being dealt with because, frankly, if I go back to the beginning, this rampant unilateral approach ignores the blindingly obvious that you can't solve the key problems as a single country. Even the United States can't do that.
So
migration.
Are you optimistic about the Treaty of Paris in climate change?
Well, there's a huge degree. I said, we're 193 countries. 100 of the countries at the UN are populations of under 10 million. Of those, a third are small island states. So you have over 35, almost 40 countries who have existential reasons to want that Paris Agreement not just respected, but in fact implemented, and we're not on track. The great moment of the Sustainable Development Goals, Paris, the INF Treaty unraveling now, but the Global Compact on Climate and Migration, they were big moments in the last 5 or 10 years, but they're now vulnerable because of that dysfunctionality I spoke earlier. I would say on Paris, it's probably the one that has the most sort of political determination behind it. I'm not revealing anything I haven't said publicly before, that I have great faith in Emmanuel Macron. I think he's a rather extraordinary man, and he has, I think, embraced leadership on the issue. He's linking gender to it. He's very, very clearly, and Ireland would hugely subscribe to this view, sees Paris as critical to conflict resolution, because a lot of the climate engendered conflict on the African continent, for example, is now provoking migration and provoking instability. Some could argue, help Mr. Trump be elected. So these are linked. None of these issues are individual issues that can be solved by one country or individually on their own. So there is a sort of a chain, a blockchain dimension to the kind of problems we're dealing with, and therefore the political weight behind it. I think the European Union, in this case led formerly by Angela Merkel, Mother Climate, now by Macron on this, have really captured the public imagination.
That's great. So just switching gears slightly, thinking of Ireland, how is Ireland viewed in the UN context? Are there positive or negative assumptions about the Irish that you might like to reflect on?
Because I reflect on this every minute of every day, wearing the T-shirt. Look, I don't think it's chauvinistic if I say that people regard us as the quintessential UN country. You mentioned I have a lovely office. I'm lucky as a diplomat to live in a government-owned property, and I think as an example of Ireland seeing the world through a UN prism, and we do still see us. The government bought the property I now live in 1956, which, if you think of what Ireland was like at the time, is a pretty remarkable decision to make, to invest in an apartment for a diplomat in New York. But part of the reason was that the foreign minister at the time came and spent 3 months of the year in New York. We today, however many years later, 60-something years later, we have missions in 80 countries around the world. I've mentioned again that 193, so we're not on the ground every day in 113 countries. Back in 1956, I think we had 22 missions abroad. So, in other words, Irish foreign policy was pushed out here through the UN. And to some extent, today we do that. So, first of all, we have always seen the UN as a forum that Ireland could find itself in and express itself in. That big term that we use all the time about multilateralism, it's a respect for rule of law, and it's a kind of a solidarity about how you do your business. For me, that defines both of our drivers at the UN. That respect for international law from the get-go mattered much more to Ireland and matters much more to those 100 countries with populations of 10 million than it does to China or to India or to the US. Because, at the end of the day, we are dependent on occasionally the kindness of strangers, but in fact that translates into a recognizable legal framework where we can have our own rights and our entitlements and the benefits of being a small country on a big stage respected. But with that comes the Irishness of our being able to see that in others. And there's where our sense of empathy, our partnership, which we see as natural because we've known when we didn't have it. We've had our troubled history and we haven't enjoyed partnership over time.
Big parts of
there
this
you
book.
go. Partnership, empathy and independence are bylines, but I think that partnership has worked for us in the UN. People still to this day will look for our name on a resolution or will ask me all the time, will we turn up to something? Because an Irish presence at an event brings a degree of credibility. I wouldn't exaggerate this, and I know I'm being streamed, so other countries of course carry equal credibility, but none of it's as interesting as the Irish credibility.
So Ambassador, I've heard you give credit to the overseas service of thousands of Irish priests and nuns for hundreds of years. Maybe it goes back even to how the Irish saved the world in the Dark Ages. But I found this, and I thought I'd give you a copy of it in case you don't have one. It's a book, St. Patrick's Foreign Legions, a souvenir of 1961 by a priest called Martin Bain. And it's got where we have people, missions in Europe, America, Oceania, Asia, Africa, and they're all here. So I thought I'd give you this and say for Ambassador Geraldine Byrne Nason, leading St. Patrick's Foreign Legions in the 21st century. But would you like to comment on, on that we have a tradition of service out there already?
Absolutely. Well, this is wonderful. I will treasure this. I may well add it to my voting list and double check if there is some. It's funny, when I was coming on my posting here, you get pre-posting briefings, and someone told me check all the religious orders and their geographical distribution, and this goes to speak to that. It has, put in a simple way, I like to say to people that, wherever Irish people have gone off the island, we have never done harm to people where we arrived. And that is a remarkable thing, and it's a huge pride that I have in being able to say that, because if you look around the countries, let's say, who sit at that top table in the Security Council, there's no one there can say that. We have no colonial baggage. We have never invaded a country. We have never brought our troops except as peacekeepers. And the first sort of line of Irish people, diplomat, politicians, really, were nuns, priests, educators, and health workers. And and President Higgins, in the most poetic way, speaks about this, deep in our system, in our DNA is a sense of solidarity with the vulnerable and the marginalized. And that has stayed deep in the living memory still of particularly African countries. And I mentioned earlier, it's so common that I meet an ambassador or a minister from Africa, as I did this week, who will say to me, I can recite all of Yeats. Father Maguire taught me in St. Mary's in Nairobi, or I've been told also by some African politicians they hid under nuns' beds during their revolution, because of course our priests and our nuns, like Irish people in general, were highly politically aware and active in their countries of adoption. They helped to birth many countries. When Nelson Mandela came to Ireland, I know that the deep respect he had for the support Ireland gave in his own struggle and his own country's struggle is also respected. I had the South African ambassador in the mission yesterday for lunch telling me about the priest he was educated by Christian Brothers in a shanty town. So these people definitely laid the seeds of that solidarity and support. I think many of them now, generationally, it's a memory rather than an active service. And the predecessor, a predecessor of mine, Richard Ryan, probably known to many of you here, said when he did the job that I'm now engaged in and trying to have Ireland elected to the Security Council, he said he met many of the educators and health workers who were still in the church at the time. 20 years later now, that's harder to do. But I think just to finish up on it, I think our non-governmental organisations, our Trócaire, Concern Workers, Goal, Irish Aid, and the extraordinary work they do, Africa, Asia, they're the new generation of the St. Patrick's Legions, even if they don't know it or call themselves that.
Well, you mentioned the bid for the UN Security Council, and the ambassador gave me this badge, which she has on as well, which is an Irish shamrock with the dove of UN Peace superimposed on it. So we're running for a UN Security Council seat, 21, 22, the elections next June. We're for 2 seats that are available, and we're up against Canada and Norway. So two of the three will win it. So why is Ireland pursuing a seat on the UN Security Council? Is it going to be more trouble than it's worth, given how contentious issues are? And what's in it for Ireland?
Well, it's certainly a lot of trouble. I admit to that straight away. I mean, it's known now as a sort of the most hotly contested election to the Security Council in several generations. So, and that's not our fault. Ireland was last on the Security Council 20 years ago. I think our modesty doesn't push us into a situation like some other countries which feel every 5 or 7 years it's my turn again, and they put their hands up very frequently. We wait our turn actually, and there's no rotational rhythm, but you know, for a country of our size, we've served 2 full terms in our history before, 1 half term by chance, as it were. Why are we running? I think we see ourselves as a smaller member state, and small is not a negative term at the UN. Sometimes it's small almost equates to integrity and often skill and capacity, because we're small we need to be able to project ourselves well. I think we feel that a country like ours, our voice is needed at the table, that the notion that power and might is right is clearly not working, and that there is, you know, and I don't pretend to say otherwise, there is a degree of dysfunctionality at that top table, and that the elected members, there are 10 elected members, of whom a certain number, when I say we're modest, you know, bigger countries like Japan, Brazil, India, run very often. So let's say you take the 3 of them out of the reckoning, you're really looking at 7 countries coming up every 2 years for a chance to sit there. And we think it's an opportunity for responsibility. There used to be a consideration in terms of electing countries, that you would look at how a country in its own way, in a practical way, supports international peace and security. And that used to translate to examining peacekeeping support. We're second to none, really, not in hard numbers. You can look over time at the hard numbers. We're the only country in the UN which has had an unbroken record of peacekeeping service. We have never, for a single day since 1958, not had Irish peacekeepers on the ground in fragile areas across the world. And on any one day now, we have about 1,000 men and women engaged in our peacekeeping operations, 700-800 in the field, turning around with 200 or 300 getting ready to go out. So we have demonstrated our own, modest as we may be, contribution to peacekeeping.
That's very impressive.
I think people also, if I may just say that, I think people see Ireland and the way in which we have managed to emerge. Somebody said you speak more about yourself now, earlier, as an island. Dermot, is it? George said you speak more about yourself as an island, and we do. I think that we think of ourselves as a global island now, in that we have learned how to build bridges. We have found ourselves a place at a very big, difficult table in Brussels, and suddenly found out, you know what, we know how to do this. Yeah. We have been adopted, I think, as mediators. We have shown our capacity, as I say, to change our own society. So what I'm describing is a lived experience of conflict resolution on our own island. Yeah. And Mary McAleese, I think, was the one who said that we are a first world country with a raw third world memory. Yeah. And a developing country memory. We don't use first and third worlds anymore, but that was a quote from her at a time. And that has huge resonance in the UN, because at the end of the day, I sat with an ambassador of an African country today, plying my wares, asking, you know, what their view would be of Ireland. And she said to me, the way we look at you is, how would you look and sit on that council? And would you look and think like a country from Africa? And as we look at you, your premium that you put on respecting, as there are 270 migrants across the globe, what you do in your development policy, the fact that it's not a trade aid policy, the idea that you put your own people in harm's way. Anybody want to guess how many peacekeepers there are from Russia or the United States out there now? I can tell you there are 90 each. each of those two countries of 90.
Wow.
You know, Ireland actually puts its people as well as its money where its mouth is. So I think that is respected in the UN system. And I also would argue, surprisingly, that our EU membership is a huge advantage to Ireland in this campaign and seen as something people are concerned about losing at the top table. By the time we get to the end of 2021, there will be one EU country on the Security Council.
Wow.
And that will be France. So that wow that came from Miriam is something I get every day. People say, well, wait a minute, I mean, where will the, and you look around and they're not there. The British will no longer, unfortunately, regrettably, be at the EU table, very likely.
And France would be representing itself. Right?
Voila. So a lot of countries say, well, you can't leave the French there on their own. So we of course, the French don't want to be there on their own. The French recognise their role as a much more representative role. So, the bringing the EU, the weight of the EU is the biggest development investor, or the development support in the world. We're the biggest investor in the developing world. We're the country with probably the strongest human right, or the group of countries, strongest human rights record. We've the biggest humanitarian budget. So a lot of countries in Asia and Africa say, well, hold on a minute, we want to see an EU voice there. We would bring that with us.
That's fascinating. I hadn't really thought of the EU voice, but that's really interesting. Clearly with the famine and colonization and migration, you have, as you say, a good experience in that area. So that leads me on to gender then, and your role on the UN Commission on Women. And how would you feel about the argument that women leaders play a greater role than men when it comes to conflict resolution, or that we need more women at the table?
Well, I'd agree with your second comment that we need more women at the table. The first, unfortunately, isn't true in pure empirical terms, in that we don't have enough women. At the moment, the statistics all show, it's a bit like the economic argument about women on the board of a company, statistics all show that peace negotiated with women being involved, so women negotiated peace agreements, are more durable than anything. In fact, they're sustainable. Mary Robinson has argued this for a very long time and has done a huge amount of work on the ground, grassroots women in Africa. The Irish Good Friday Agreement is a prime example of engaging women in the negotiation process, or women pushing their way in. They weren't so much invited as arrived. We frequently have Monica McWilliams, Brona Hines in the UN talking to Yemeni women, talking to Syrians, because we know that without them at the table, the peace won't be a durable one. And we also know that from a very practical point of view, that women's engagement ensures that issues that are often left out of peace agreements, like reconciliation, like victimhood, like education across segregation lines, whether it's religious or national identity lines. Those are the kind of issues, what I spoke about earlier in my education about the soft power part of a female head. Those issues tend to be introduced by women in peace agreements and just simply don't make it to the table. Unfortunately, in the last 2 years, I think of all peace agreements negotiated, only 4% of them included women in them, so it's shockingly low. The most translated resolution of the UN ever, over time, is a resolution called 1325. I see Katerina from the Irish Mission smiling. She has this on her brain because that's a resolution, that's women, peace and security resolution. It's the debate that's most oversubscribed at the Security Council. But where do you move from the rhetoric to the reality? You have the massive gaps. You have governments with action plans to include women. You have investment in training women, but actually when it comes to the hardcore negotiations, women are not getting to the table, and the Afghan situation is a glaring example of that, where we know what happened with the Taliban, And Afghan women, for the first time, they've nominated the Afghan government as a young female representative at the UN, a brilliant young woman. Her big concern is the women were not at the table in the last round of negotiations. So, you know, if you want sustainable peace and development, you simply cannot ignore 50% of the global population.
That's a very good point. So we can open up for questions now. I think there's a microphone that's going around. Do we have a mic?
There is one.
Does somebody have the mic? Hello? Yes, you've got it here. We can pass it back to somebody. If you would like to identify yourself and speak to the microphone so you can be heard on the broadcast. Who wants to ask a question?
You sure there's no one back there? I can't see you guys. Come on, that was so tantalizing. There have to be questions. I'll be happy to kick it off. Ambassador, is there, I know this is a bit presumptuous and it's based on pure ignorance. Is there any role that the Irish American community can play in aiding you in this very amazing, important quest to be a member of the Security Council? Can we do anything?
Thank you, Loretta. Well, I mean, what I haven't spoken about in our bid for the Security Council, and what some would say when you look at the lineup, Ireland, Canada, Norway, what's the distinguishing feature? And I think our national identity and our cultural heritage, while you may not think that they should play a role in sitting at the Security Council, I think they are absolutely critical. So the Irish reputational reach that the Irish American community bring here, not just in the United States, but in the work that you do in support of the Irish government off this continent, in Latin America, in Europe, and particularly in Asia and in business contacts, all of that reputational strength plays to the credibility, I think, of Ireland on the floor of the UN. So those who are minded to speak to the global Ireland as part of a 21st century common approach, that we see ourselves as having almost outgrown our little peripheral island in the Atlantic, and that, you know, while North America tends to be the best example of that, that we are now a diaspora that's reaching other continents. I've been doing this job for more than a few decades, and I've never seen a government that's looking as much beyond the island as this one. It's a young government, it's an ambitious government, and I think if the Irish community here in North America speak to that new Ireland, and the second thing I would say, which helps us in the UN, is that it's a new Ireland as well. The homogeneity of the Ireland of the past is not the Ireland that we represent on the floor of the UN anymore. We speak about the new Irish, the 1 in 6 people who are not born in Ireland, who make up also the new Irish in North America. We speak to an Ireland that has managed a progressive economic agenda with, I think, a progressive socio-cultural agenda as well. We've managed to translate ourselves into a 21st century, and the more that the Irish American community, you know, sort of speaks about Ireland as not so much the Emerald Isle that we remember, but much more as a global player, that we're now up for it and able for it, the more people look at us as an able, agile, geopolitical value, I would say. And then finally, I use that word value advisedly because it's something that gets overlooked a lot, but at the end of the day in the UN counts for very much, that we haven't lost our value system, and that sense of solidarity with those who suffer, a recognition that peace takes time to build, and the work the Irish American community did in our own peace building is really important, that people hear that, understand that, and that it takes investment. I've had so many African countries tell me that, you know, that the peace agreement is fine, but if you can't get jobs for the young guys on the corner, and they tend to be young men, that in no short order that peace agreement will fall apart, because you need investment, and they look to how we did that. So, but I hope as we get closer to the high jump that I can reach back in and perhaps encourage some of you who had first-hand experience of that kind of conversation to share that with others, because everybody at the UN, you know, is in awe of hopefully ongoing peace process in Ireland and a successful economic dimension. So everything that you've done over time we can bring to the table if you
That's good advice for the diaspora. I wonder if the agility and creativity we have comes from Irish dancing and music. There might be some origins in it. Professor Kenny, did you have a question?
I do.
Do we have a mic? We have the mic here. Nice.
It's a question about the UN that in some ways goes beyond the Irish case, but actually I think it's deeply relevant. It has to do with migration, which of course marks our history, and you've mentioned the African nations so many times this evening. Wondering about climate-induced migration, if you could talk a little bit about that as an issue at the UN today.
For sure. I mean, I think that migration, as you said, is part of our DNA, and it's been one of the hot-button lightning rod issues in the UN. It's not just in a domestic environment that is contested, and we've had a difficulty discussing in the UN migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, legal, illegal migration, but we have actually done some good work at the UN, coming up with frameworks where we can all speak to each other about what the challenges are and how you manage. I'm not sure people here recognize it, but 70% of migration globally now is all in the south. So it's not, as we would tend to think, rushes of migrants coming from the south to the north. It's actually people across borders, and that comes to why that might be. We see, particularly if you take one region in Africa, the Sahel region, the Malian ambassador, who's a highly able diplomat and a friend, and I never sort of, I'm always happy to see him, because you take away another insight into what his country is dealing with. He would argue that climate-induced migration is really at the core of a huge degree of the instability in that whole Sahel region, and that it's also driving the drug trade, not just human trafficking, but also arms trafficking, and that unfortunately his country geostrategically is plunked right in the middle. You have Niger. If you look at Chad, what's happened in Chad, where somebody like Mary Robinson says, you know, she remembers going and seeing the enormous Lake Chad, which is now dry. You have women, a lot of women in those regions who are the first and most vulnerable in climate-induced migration, who simply have to up sticks with their children. They can't feed their children, and they're on the move, and of course massively exploited in that, generating you know, I guess, opportunity for people, traffickers, to exploit them, but then pushing to the north. So the situation the Sahel finds itself in, which is the source of much instability in Africa, is that in the south of the Sahel you have climate-induced migration. In the north you have a Libyan situation where arms were not cleaned up in any shape or form. There was no governance system put in place after the Gaddafi collapse, and so you have now these climate induced, is the only term you can use for it, poverty-stricken countries who have themselves had their governance collapse. So we are looking at, as I said earlier, there are no individual problems here. These are, you can't say that migration is a choice people are making. They're making the only choice for survival there is in that particular region. But it's not, my Namibian colleague, and that's a larger African country with a stable government, but increasingly desertification is pushing. I met him recently and he said they're worried about instability in their bigger cities, and he said it's climate induced. It's because the rural populations are pushed off the agricultural lands that they have over time nomadically farmed, and they're now being pushed into the outer edges of their cities. And in Windhoek, their capital, he said now they have massive shanty towns with hundreds and thousands of young men in particular, women with small children being exploited, climate migrants in the edges of their big cities. So it's a new paradigm in terms of conflict. It's a new paradigm in terms of development challenges, but it's also, interestingly, a new paradigm in terms of gender inequality, because the vulnerability of women on the move is hugely being exploited. And I can't lose the opportunity, I'm afraid to say here, that it pains me hugely, having chaired the Commission on the Status of Women for 2 years, that today my young, brilliant diplomat in the Human Rights Committee texted me to say that the US had just objected to the use of the term gender equality in any of the documents that were being adopted, and that any reference to sexual reproductive health for women who were violated in conflict would have to be removed. This wonderful country that had set the tone, set the pace on gender equality, now for the most vulnerable women on the move in Africa, where we set in the CSW sort of the norms for decent behaviour in relation to the vulnerable. We find in relation to women in particular being pushed back now, and that worries us a lot. That's a long way around saying the link between climate and migration is a clear-cut political challenge and security risk. And we, as a candidate for the Security Council, are pushing the envelope a little bit on this, because the United States, Russia and China do not accept that there is something that you can define as climate security that can be discussed at the Security Council. We would argue, as a country, that if you see Mali, where we are putting our peacekeepers in to keep a lid on horrendous pressure cooker of small, large armed traffic, drugs, violence, that type of security challenge generated by climate is not a justifiable and indeed a needed discussion at the top table in the UN. The idea that it somehow would be treated by the 3 permanent members I've discussed as an issue that doesn't affect security also offends hugely the small islands we spoke about earlier, who actually, for them, it's existential security, because their security is their entire population. One young woman said to me recently, we have nowhere for our garbage to go, and the garbage on the island is now higher than the highest building we have on the island, and we're gradually watching the ocean rise. So garbage is rising, the ocean is rising higher, and their population is threatened. If that's not a human security issue, what is? So.
Clearly we need the UN. If we can't agree on fighting for gender equality, racial equality and climate security, that's a very sad situation. A lot of work to be done. We seem to be going in reverse. So has anybody got a cheerful question for us? Anything out there?
Somebody at the back.
The back here, yes. Can we get a mic back there, please? And like to give us your name too, that would be great.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for a wonderful presentation.
Sorry, can't quite hear the question. Hold it a little bit away, yeah.
Hold the mic away from your mouth.
He is married. He's doing
Maybe you
both
don't
ways.
need a
Mic isn't
microphone.
working.
Maybe
Just
you
get it, just stand up.
just stand up and
Stand up.
Shout at us.
Just repeat the question.
Thank you, Excellency, for your presentation.
And I'm an engineer, and I know that the United Nations has undertaken some wonderful effort towards the greenhouse problem that we have. So what is Ireland's contribution or joint venture in that respect?
So the question is, what's Ireland's contribution to solutions to the greenhouse effect?
Well, I mean, Ireland, again, recognising that no matter what we do on our own is not going to solve the problem, we are part of the broader European commitment to a carbon neutral economy by 2050. When the Prime Minister of Ireland came here in September, he also announced not just that we are committed to a carbon neutral economy by 2050, we will cut our greenhouse gases by 50% by 2030, so these are all statistics, but that we immediately stopped all oil exploration off the coast of Ireland on the day he spoke on the stage. And they are actual concrete commitments that have economic implications, but obviously contribute to the broader reduction of greenhouse gases. We also are part of a carbon trading system, a European Union carbon trading system. So we, you know, for every so many tons of CO2 that we emit, we compensate by paying into the carbon emission system, which by extension then reduces the cost of adaptation and mitigation in other countries. We are doing something else which I think is much more important though, which is less, what's the term I would use, it's less forensic in terms of how you examine the impact, but I think more important in the medium term, that we have been identified in the UN as leading youth and public advocacy on climate. And Ireland has traditionally in the UN been seen as a leader for civil society, for ensuring it's not just government to government spats that go on, but that the wise people, all of you here in this room, but also non-governmental organisations, and importantly now youth, get inside the door, have a place in the negotiation. So we, at the Climate Change Summit this year, were asked with the Marshall Islands, I think their population is around 50,000, the Marshall Islands, that we would lead the youth engagement in climate. And so as part of that youth engagement, we committed to, on any piece of environmental legislation that our government in Ireland looks at, to having a consultation with youth on this. So we are, by extension, engaging youth in the design of our future environmental policy. We'll hand over our Parliament in Ireland in November, in this month, before the end of the month, for a day to youth green activists to discuss environment policy with elected members of the Parliament and with the government. This is, you know, Greta Thunberg carries in a way the mantle, but this is something we're told that the Marshall Islands youth have been doing for a long time. The youth in countries most affected by climate have been trying to find their voice, and suddenly the UN in a way has opened up to that. So we're seen to be in the leading wave of doing that, and that's something I'm particularly proud of.
Wow.
Yeah. Is Ireland affected by flooding, and what they do about it?
Is
Yeah,
Ireland
we
affected
are.
by flooding?
We are. I'll tell you a tale out of school. I'm always a bit nervous when visiting ministers say we have a climate challenge as well, but because relative to the Bahamas, of course, where you have a hurricane like Dorian that is just is unprecedented globally. We're not in that sort of a situation. But we've had our first hurricane. We have now major annual flood problems in our big cities. So in the south of Ireland, in Cork, we actually had a situation where parts of the city were evacuated. I think that's 18 months ago. So we're building defences all along the Irish coast. So we are doing what we traditionally call adaptation. and putting up some mitigation measures as well, where as we go, you'll all know that we had a deep dive into economic crisis not that long ago in 2011, and I was actually back in Dublin at the time. I was chairing the Economic Management Council, and we saw we were creating a problem for ourselves on climate change at the time, because we were forbidden by the EU IMF programme, for which we were extremely grateful, but we were not allowed to invest in any capital projects over the time we were implementing that programme. So until we recovered and were back in the markets, there was no capital investment. That was just at the time we were seeing that the effects of climate change on our infrastructure were pretty serious, and we needed flood barrier investments. We needed to look at our coastal defences, and we identified the problem. We weren't able to invest in the solution, so we're playing catch up, and that we recognise. But this government has a plan and has very concrete objectives to actually reach the targets. But we are playing catch up, I would recognise that.
Well, thank you. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but before I ask Kevin and Loretta to do a formal vote of thanks, I'd just like to say that Ireland and the UN is very fortunate to have such a visionary, intelligent and eloquent ambassador as you.
Here, here.
Thank you, Ambassador, for such insights into how the UN works and for bringing us to the table as you've done. Before we move downstairs for a reception, on behalf of Glucksman Ireland House, we'd like to make a small presentation, and Loretta, you might want to say a word.
Thank you,
Or
Kevin.
should,
Thank you.
give
I
them
can
a
use
turn.
this one. Oh, you can hear me, can't you?
No.
Hey, Mick. Boy, it's good to see you. It's great to see you. Well, first, if I may, point of personal privilege. I get so boring about that, and I don't want to overuse it. But this is an extraordinary night for me in Ireland House. I couldn't be prouder of a woman, big point on that, but a woman that has, I'm sorry, you can't hear. That a woman represents us in the most important time, in my opinion, in the world, both physically, politically, every other way we can, to have Geraldine Byrne Nason be the voice of Ireland. It may be the only entity that could save this chaotic world from spinning totally into chaos.
Here, here.
And I think Geraldine's work will be looked at in history as turning points on so many things, and I'm just deeply chuffed. First of all, that you are with us tonight. I know there are larger requests that come to you every day, and the fact that you come to our wonderful little place, and I learned more tonight than I have for a lot of very academic sessions that I've been involved in. So this is a labor of love, and we give it to you with so much love. It's a book from Ireland House about being Irish, being New York Irish. And Kevin will sign it, and we want you to come back many, many times.